Hey all, we are nearing the end of 2022, which means we are starting to see a rollout of lists regarding best of 2022, worst of 2022, what have you. If you clicked on this, you know that this is going to be a version of a 2022 list. I am not ready to sit down and commit to a best of 2022 yet because I have not finished my 2022 reading. And while I am not going to get through as much this month as I hoped for a real kind of final push, but life happens and life happened, and that is not going to happen for me in the way I anticipated. But I am still hoping to slip some titles in under the wire. So I don't want to lock in that best of yet, but that may still be on the horizon, especially as the HarperCollins Union has indicated that it is okay to go ahead and include HarperCollins titles in lists, end of the year lists, as long as you kind of frame them around the conversation that the strike is still ongoing, because not spoiler alert, the strike is still ongoing. But for now, I want to talk about some of the books I've read this year that I think are a little underrated. Caveats are, as always, I have not read every book. In fact, this year I've read far less books than possibly ever in a long while, or at least in recorded history for the past while, although we have unfortunately been seeing a kind of downward trend the last couple years. But you know what? 2022 was rough. We'll recap all of that when it comes. However, I haven't read every title, so there are some that are underrated that I also haven't read. And also some of these you might be like, Melody, I've seen this book before. I don't have a full purview of the internet and the bookish internet. These are just the titles that I think deserve more attention, not saying that they didn't receive any attention. And also, I believe I have talked about all of these already this year because I've read them all this year, and I don't think any of them kind of fell within my brief hiatus earlier this year. So with that being said, let's jump into some of these titles. I'm going to start out strong with a book that I think is going to make it into my best of for the year, and that is Vagabonds by Eloghosa Osunde. This is a short story collection that takes place in Nigeria, primarily around Lagos. If you enjoyed How High We Go in the Dark this year, I think you will also enjoy this one because they are kind of interconnected short stories that weave in and out of this world. We see repeating characters kind of on the periphery, and there's also this sense of the odd or the supernatural that kind of weaves throughout. I would say Vagabonds falls more on the supernatural side, and How High We Go in the Dark is a little bit more sci-fi, but there are still those elements of kind of the spiritual and the supernatural in that collection as well. But I loved this short story collection, this novel, and I think it is cohesively threaded in terms of being a novel or being able to be labeled a novel by its thematic connection. And I think that the way that it cements itself together, primarily around the idea of the spirits of this city, the spirits of protection, especially when it's kind of contrasting itself against the Christianity in the country as well, and how we are kind of introduced and brought into the world through that kind of inversion, is just fantastic and inventive and so smart. And I think that the whole collection is just incredibly smart in terms of its structure and the way that it weaves in and out of these lives and these stories, but also its power to draw readers into the emotional wealth and underbelly of this world and these people. It is looking at those on the outskirts of this society in a lot of ways. There is especially a real emphasis on queer stories and queer narratives in this collection, and it gives the full breadth and humanity to these stories within these little slivers of life. We have hope and heartbreak juxtaposed often in the same stories, and that really offers a fullness and a vibrancy to everything that's going on that just is reinforced by these kind of interludes with the spirits of this place and the spirits of protection of this place. And that juxtaposition kind of permeates, whether it be in theme, in idea, in ideology, in just the state of our characters. There's a real look at isolation versus community and where those can kind of mesh, and how both are kind of born of survival and safety in some ways, but it really kind of brings us to the joy and fullness of community. But it's painting this very full picture from these very fragmented pieces. And I think, like I said, it is just expertly done. It is moving, it is engaging, and the writing is just lyrical and fantastic. fantastic. The writing in this was superb. It was one of the only books I like sticky noted passages in this year. I just really loved it. Additionally, the cover is just fantastic. Now, this is or was or continues to be an advanced read copy that I won through a Goodreads giveaway. So this is not just a beautiful story, a beautiful collection, but one that illuminates the beauty in those often overlooked. So if you have by chance overlooked this book this year, I definitely think it is well worth your time. I absolutely adored it. And again, if you are searching for something that is short stories that live within the same universe, that are in the same world, interconnected, this is definitely something right up your alley. And even though I am woefully behind on anticipated short story collections this year because I was anticipating a lot and I have read basically none of them. There were some really excellent collections that came out this year, so I am going to work to get to those. But one I did get to is one that hadn't been on my radar before Indie Bookstore Day. I saw it on a table in Women and Children First, and I was like, that looks excellent, and I picked it up. And indeed, I was correct. It was excellent. And that is Maria Maria by Maritza K. Rubio. This, I believe, also made a list, I believe, for the National Book Award. And if you are a millennial like me, when you see this title, you may immediately kind of think of the Santana song, but this goes beyond that. These are weird and inventive, the kind of short stories I really gravitate toward. And the skeletons on the cover are what gave me hope of that really pulled through. And the first story in this collection is just such an excellent entry into the worlds of these stories that are all so different, but really introduces us as readers to the kind of flavor of story that we're going to have here. It's called Brujeria for Beginners, and it takes place in what I could only assume or get the feel or sense of in the story is like a community college, but the class at the center of this story is not your typical community college class, as you could probably deduce from the title. And we are getting the story being told as if the teacher is kind of talking to the class, though in a weird, different kind of way. It's a little bit more formal. The tone is not quite as casual as you might talk to your class, but also still is. It really excels at showcasing different voices and points of view in all of the stories. It plays with form. There's a story that has different like pictures of art, and the short story is the captions of those pieces and the story being told through those captions. And it explores so many deep and compelling themes within these really compelling, inventive stories. And they are just incredibly readable, incredibly engaging, and I really enjoyed this collection. It was an excellent discovery, my best kind of just random pickup in the bookstore of the year by far. I was ecstatic to see it make some lists, or at least the one list, though in my book it has not received nearly enough attention. I know short story collections usually don't necessarily receive as much attention as they probably should, although, you know, not always across the board. But I definitely think that it is a stellar collection deserving of the attention and that more people should pick it up. Now, speaking of forms that don't necessarily receive as much attention as, say, something like fiction, let's talk about poetry for a second. I have been trying kind of to branch out a little bit more into poetry. I know probably the least about poetry. I mean, I know as much as you learned in high school about poetry, but I don't consider myself an expert on the form at all. It's hard to articulate, I think, with poetry, and I think that's some of the power of poetry as well. It's about eliciting those emotions and exploring how to reflect those emotions and those interiors through form. But it's also an incredibly layered craft because you have to be so specific with every word, every beat, every space. There is a real intention to everything that is on the page with poetry. And I definitely think it is evident when poets write in other forms in how they utilize that language. So my favorite collection of the year, which I mentioned before, is Alive at the End of the World by Sayed Jones. I already love Jones's work. His memoir that came out a couple of years ago is stunning. It is raw and engaging and heartfelt and incredibly vulnerable. And his poetry is in a similar vein. It is raw, it is honest, it is tongue-in-cheek in a way, it is searing and insightful, and it cuts right through to the thing. It doesn't mince words, it doesn't let anyone off the hook. It is going to explore both pleasure and pain in their fullness, and it also does a lot of this through a kind of pop culture lens, through a cultural lens, lens. So not in a way, or at least at this point, where it feels like it will be dated, but in a way that it doesn't divorce kind of our emotional realities from the things that shape us, the art that shapes us, music, television. And I can't think of any specifics in the collection off the top of my head because I need to buy my own copy. I got it from the library just to kind of get a sense, but it really reflects this kind of full, vibrant life. And there is also this kind of burning to it, this sense of burning bright before the end. It's alive at the end of the world. There's a kind of chaos and frenzy to it, even as it feels so specific and tight. It really reflects a real and raw emotional interior, and because of the honesty of that reflection, it allows me as a reader from a completely different lived experience to understand that emotional interior in a completely new way. So while I don't have the full analytical capabilities for poetry, I loved this collection. It made me feel things, which I think is an incredible success for poetry. And it was also just inventive and fun in its execution. And it kind of pulled on pop culture, cultural society, the zeitgeist, to reflect the current moment and the current cultural moment in a way similar to like the poetry version of what I really enjoy in nonfiction and cultural analysis. So it's just kind of more the emotional underbelly of that. But if you like poetry, I definitely encourage you to pick this up. If you're like me and you don't really know a lot about poetry or don't consider yourself well-versed in poetry, I also encourage you to pick this up because as someone who isn't well-versed, it was incredibly accessible and I loved every minute of it. All right, and then moving into some more standard fiction picks. This may throw off the white balance, but Bitter by Oweke Emezi. I know that they have been getting a lot of buzz this year for their romance, You Make a Fool of Death with Your Beauty, which I still need to get to. Don't worry, I am ashamed about that. But I was incredibly excited, intrigued, nervous in some ways for this book. This is a sequel to Pet, which I read in 2020 and just blew me away. It was one of those books that you finish and you immediately contemplate getting a teaching license just so you can lead a Socratic seminar on that one book. I didn't, but I could have. But this is a prequel to that, and it's a standalone prequel to that. So I don't think you have to have read Pet to appreciate Bitter, but I think that they work in such beautiful harmony, and I'm actually interested to how the experience might be different if you start with Bitter versus Pet. I'm not sure. So Pet is kind of looking at the aftermath of a utopia. We start in what we think is a utopia, but there are cracks, and we are kind of navigating community and how to keep those we love safe in a world where we think we have defeated all of the monsters and what that means. And in Bitter, we are looking at the before. So Pet, we are looking at this utopia, and there's this sense that there has been this big battle in the past, this triumph to get us to where we are in Pet. And so in Bitter, we are looking at the before. So if Pet is a utopia with complications, Bitter is a dystopia, and it is looking at kind of how we fight and how we build community and what our anger looks like and how our anger serves us or doesn't, and not in a judgment of that anger, but in a way that it is looking at the individual and caring for the individual through those feelings. These books are incredibly emotionally intelligent, and I think especially this book is a great way to kind of look at and analyze and navigate some of those feelings of anger and helplessness within larger systems, because it is definitely exploring this dystopia that reflects a little bit more of our current reality in terms of these systematic things that we are trying to fight back against. And amidst that as well, it is looking at what it means to build community, what community looks like, how that forms. And it's looking at fighting, individually versus fighting for something as a group, as a community. It's looking at when people might not have the energy to be a part of the fight. And it is just incredibly kind to everyone in the book. There are bad decisions, there are selfish decisions, there are decisions that are made out of strong emotion that maybe don't serve the person making that decision or the larger good, but the narrative is always incredibly understanding about how those decisions came to be, incredibly empathetic, and allows us as readers to kind of see the full broad picture there. And like I said, is incredibly emotionally intelligent in its navigation of all of that. So I think that this book as well would make an incredible source of Socratic seminar discussion. And I think that in relation to Pet, in combination with Pet, there is just so much to dig into and explore. And both books are incredibly short, so they are very specific with their language, with their plotting. They are intentional, and because of that, I think that they are also incredibly accessible for their audience, for teens, because they are succinct, they pack a punch, and there's also a real depth there. It doesn't speak down to its audience. I think it is just incredibly smart, incredibly engaging, and incredibly compassionate. So definitely recommend Bitter and also Pet, and this is coming from someone who doesn't necessarily consider myself a fan of dystopias as a genre. Dystopias aren't something I just kind of naturally gravitate toward. So do with that information what you will. And then also in the young adult space, which is kind of ironic because this year I have read the least amount of young adult I have ever read, potentially. But I really loved The Red Palace by June Her. I know this did get a decent amount of attention, especially when it came out, but I feel like it hasn't gotten as much as I would like. I think personally, and granted, I've only read 2 of her books. I haven't read her debut yet. I still need to swing back for that. But I think that she is establishing herself as a major voice within historical fiction and young adult. And I think that she is offering such unique stories within these blendings of mystery. Some have a little bit of sprinkling of romance, like in The Red Palace. Some, like The Forest of Stolen Girls, really pull back from that. So there is kind of something for a variety of tastes. And I think that the heroines that Her is writing are incredibly varied and strong and complicated. They are flawed, like we all are, but are also incredibly endearing, and as a reader, I am rooting for them. Additionally, this is historical fiction taking place in Korea. I admittedly learned a lot of history through historical fiction from middle grade on. I would say even to today. I know that it's not all, 100% correct, but it is a way to introduce readers to new worlds and to new information, and then spurs an interest and further research and engagement. So it is exciting and engaging for the worlds that she is offering within her stories themselves, because she gives such vivid imagery. Everything is incredibly visceral, especially as the stakes are rising, and so often these are mysteries, and so we've got, something on the other side of this question that is posing a threat to our protagonist, and we can feel that danger lurking and looming and closing in, and often that is visually represented. Whether it's a chase through the reeds or a man lurking in the forest in a mask, there are real pictures being painted here, and this sparks an interest and creates worlds and invites readers into new worlds. So I'm very, very excited to see how Her's work continues to develop, because I love admittedly historical fiction, so I'm excited for an exciting new voice within the landscape in young adult, because I think that in my anecdotal observational experience, there hasn't been quite as much historical fiction in that vein within the young adult space as I would personally like, but that's a personal preference. And this is offering that. I really, really enjoyed the dynamics and the world and the relationships, especially in this last book. So I definitely encourage you to pick this up if you like historical fiction and haven't checked this one out yet, because I really enjoy it. And then to kind of wrap us up, this book has definitely gotten attention, but much less honestly attention than I was expecting. I really expected this book to really be one of the big romances of the year, and that is American Royalty by Tracy Livesay. There is already a sequel announced, so I am very excited about that. I will mention, of course, that this is a HarperCollins title and that HarperCollins workers are currently on strike. I'm getting very annoyed with the lack of response from HarperCollins, the lack of legitimate response from HarperCollins, I should say. So I can only imagine what these workers are feeling, and they are fighting for themselves, for their authors, for this industry as a whole, because if they cannot perform their best, they are not able to give their authors their best, and their authors deserve their best. So it's a whole spectrum. They obviously deserve their best too. We've talked about it, But this book follows an American rap star and a British prince. So if you have been watching the Harry and Meghan documentary, I admittedly haven't, because the last week has been really awful, so I just haven't. But if you've been keeping up with that, I definitely think this is something you should read. Duchess is a rapper that is kind of trying to revitalize her career after some public feuds that have been orchestrated by a rival have kind of hampered one of her business dealings. So she's kind of trying to rehabilitate her image, though the kind of dent to her image is through no fault of her own. And she's also been trying to kind of get out from under some management that is no longer really serving her best interests. Meanwhile, Prince Jameson is a prince who has been kind of out of the public eye. His uncle is in line for the throne. He has been allowed to kind of go off and be a philosophy professor, which is his passion, but he is getting kind of called in by his grandmother to orchestrate or serve as the public face of this benefit concert for his grandfather's charities, and his grandmother is kind of holding these charities and his relationship with his grandfather over his head in order to have him be the face of this event, because they also need some kind of rehabilitation to their image. He's well liked and hasn't really been in the public eye, so they're pulling him in for this. Through some happenstances, him and Duchess get thrown together for a short time at his estate, where they kind of butt heads at first, partly because of Jameson's attraction to her, but where I think this book is the most fun is when they get kind of back in the public eye and they're trying to navigate this. Duchess also has a friendship with a fellow pop star, kind of a Harry Styles-esque character, and we get to kind of watch their friendship and how that friendship serves them both within the public eye in some ways, but also that is a source of jealousy for Jameson in some ways, not toxic jealousy, just, you know, watching these two characters that are not necessarily supposed to be together by some standards of this book, and how they gravitate toward each other and fight for their relationship, but are also very aware of what that means. And there are career pieces at play on both sides of this that I really appreciate. So you can see their full lives, and there's some weight to this relationship, as well as being incredibly sexy, of course. So I'm actually very intrigued knowing there's a sequel, seeing some of these romance titles move into this model potentially. I don't know, I think it's interesting, we'll see. So those are a handful of the books that I've read this year that I think deserve some more love. I would also love to hear what books you think deserve more love. Thanks for hanging out with me today as I discuss them, and for hanging in with me because I don't feel like I have been as on it today. But again, last week was rough, so what you gonna do? Thanks for being here. Read something good, like and subscribe if you feel like it, and yeah,